Welcome to Cocotales Reddit, where we share the stories that are whispered between friends, the ones that keep you up at night, wondering what you would do. It's funny, isn't it? How we can plan our lives so perfectly, like we're arranging pretty little dolls in a dollhouse. We have the career doll, the apartment doll, the friendship doll, all lined up just so. And then, life comes along like a reckless toddler and just smashes it all to pieces. Have you ever had a moment that completely split your life into a before and an after? For me, that moment arrived with the shrill, insistent ring of my phone at 2 in the morning. It wasn't just a sound. It was an alarm, signaling that the quiet, orderly life I was so carefully building was about to be set on fire. I remember fumbling for the phone, my voice thick with sleep, my mind still lost in a dream. It was Marcus, my older brother. His voice was a low, urgent whisper, laced with a kind of desperation I hadn't heard in years. "Sarah, I need your help. I have no one else," he said, the words tumbling out so fast they almost tripped over each other. I sat bolt upright in bed, the drowsiness vanishing like a ghost at sunrise. Marcus. We weren't exactly close. He had always been the prodigal son, the storm cloud on the family horizon, and in recent years, he'd drifted even further away. I barely knew his kids, my niece and nephew, beyond a few awkward hellos at holiday gatherings. "Marcus, it's 2 in the morning, I managed to say, my nurse brain already trying to triage the situation. What kind of problem can't wait until the sun comes up? He ignored my question, his voice cracking. "It's about Emma and Jake. I need you to take them. Just for a few weeks, Sarah. Just until I can sort some things out." There was a pause, and I could hear him take a shaky breath before he delivered the line that would detonate my world. "Crystal said if the kids don't leave the house, she's leaving. And Sarah, I love this woman. She's different. Crystal, the new girlfriend. I'd met her exactly once, at a family barbecue, a few months back. I remembered her perfectly manicured nails, the expensive-looking handbag, and the way she'd looked at 5-year-old Emma and 3-year-old Jake as if they were sticky messes she was afraid would ruin her white jeans. She had been cold, dismissive, and now she was giving my brother an ultimatum. My heart clenched. "Marcus, you can't be serious," I whispered, horrified. "You can't just ship your children off because your new girlfriend can't handle them." "It's not abandonment," he practically shouted, then immediately lowered his voice again, probably so Crystal wouldn't hear. "It's temporary. A few weeks, maybe a month. We just need to find a bigger place, somewhere she feels more comfortable." Every rational part of me wanted to scream no. I had just passed my nursing boards, started my first real job. My life was a fragile ecosystem of long shifts, studying, and trying to pay my rent on a tiny one-bedroom apartment. I had no room, no time, no capacity for 2 small children. But then my mind conjured up their faces. Sweet little Emma, who was only 5, and Jake, just 3, with his thumb perpetually in his mouth. My resolve crumbled. He knew it would. "Where are they even going to sleep, Marcus?" "I only have 1 bedroom, I said, already knowing it was a weak protest. "You'll figure it out. You always do," he said, and the manipulation in his voice was so thick I could taste it. "Family doesn't abandon family, Sarah. You know that." He was right. I did always figure it out, and he always used that against me. 3 hours later, as the sky was just starting to blush with the first hints of dawn, Marcus was at my door. He wasn't alone. He had 2 giant, overstuffed suitcases and a brightly colored folder in his hands. The children were still in the back seat of his car, dressed in mismatched pajamas. their faces pale and confused in the dim morning light. Emma clutched a teddy bear so worn its fur was patchy, and Jake was sucking his thumb, his eyes wide and scared. "Here's everything you need to know," Marcus said, shoving the folder at me. He didn't make eye contact. He just started rattling off instructions like a drill sergeant. Feeding schedules, bath routines, what shows they can watch. Emma can't have chocolate after 4 p.m. or she gets hyper. Jake still needs diapers at night. I opened the folder, and my stomach dropped. It wasn't just a few helpful notes. It was a manifesto. A rigid, military-style schedule that dictated every single minute of their day, from wake-up time to bedtime. There was a list of forbidden foods that spanned an entire page. There were rules about visitors, rules about outings, rules about everything. "Marcus, this is insane," I said, flipping through the pages. "This looks more like a work contract than a guide to babysitting." "Children need structure, Sarah. This is how we do things," he said dismissively, already turning to leave. He was at the door when he stopped and threw one last grenade over his shoulder. "Oh, and you'll need to cancel any plans you have for the next few weekends. The kids can't be with strangers." I stared at his back, stunned. "Wait, what? Weekends? I thought this was just for while you're at work." He didn't even turn around. "Crystal and I need our time together. Relationships need to be nurtured, Sarah. You'll get it when you find someone." And with that, he was gone. He just walked away, leaving me in my doorway with 2 enormous suitcases and 2 tiny, terrified human beings who were staring up at me as if I were their last hope. Emma looked at me, her big brown eyes swimming with unshed tears. "Where did Daddy go?" she whispered. "When is he coming back?" I knelt down, trying to smile, trying to look like the capable aunt who had everything under control. But as I looked into her scared little face, I couldn't find the words to reassure her. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because a cold, heavy feeling was already settling in my gut. A terrifying suspicion that my brother had no intention of coming back when he said he would. The first 2 weeks were a special kind of hell. The kind you're not prepared for. The kind that rewrites everything you thought you knew about your own family. It started with the smell. When I finally unpacked their suitcases, a damp, musty odor of mold and old food hit me. It clung to their clothes, their blankets, even their worn-out stuffed animals. It was the smell of neglect. I immediately drew a bath for them, and that's when I saw it. The first real, terrifying red flag. When I helped Emma out of her grubby t-shirt, I had to physically stop myself from gasping. She was so thin. I'm a nurse. I know what a healthy 5-year-old body is supposed to look like. And this wasn't it. Her ribs were starkly visible under her pale skin, like a tiny bird. But it was the marks that made my blood run cold. Small, ugly bruises dotted her little arms, some of them a sickly yellow-green, others a deep, angry purple. They were in different stages of healing. "Sweetheart, what happened here?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light and steady, trying not to let the alarm I felt show on my face. She wouldn't look at me. She just stared down at the bath mat, her little shoulders hunched. "I fell down the stairs," she mumbled, the words sounding practiced, rehearsed. "Daddy said I'm clumsy." My heart twisted. A child might fall down the stairs once, but these many bruises? It felt wrong. It felt like a lie. Jake was another story entirely. At 3 years old, he should have been a little chatterbox, a whirlwind of questions and noise. Instead, he was eerily quiet. He seemed lost, wandering around my small apartment as if he'd landed on another planet. He flinched every time I raised my voice, even if I was just calling them for dinner from the kitchen. He was a ghost of a child, and it was the most heartbreaking thing I had ever seen. That first night was a blur of tears. Emma cried for 2 solid hours, a desperate, gut-wrenching sob that seemed to come from the very core of her being. "I want to go home," she wailed, curled up in a ball on my couch. "I want my daddy." I tried everything in my power to soothe her. I read her stories. I sang her lullabies I barely remembered. I even broke my own rules and let her watch cartoons on the television in my bedroom. Nothing worked. I just held her, whispering, "He'll be back soon, sweetheart. He just has to sort some things out," feeling like the world's biggest liar. The next day, I started trying to contact Marcus. The new number he had left me? Disconnected. I tried his old number, the one I had saved in my phone for years. Out of service. A knot of panic began to form in my stomach. I sent him messages on every social media platform I could think of. Sent emails to an old address. Even called a couple of guys he used to work with. It was like he had dropped off the face of the earth. That's when I uncovered the first concrete lie. The folder he'd given me said Emma was supposed to be in preschool from 9 a.m. to noon. I thought, okay, at least that's a few hours of normalcy for her, a place to be with other kids. I called the school to confirm the details. The secretary on the other end was polite, but firm. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but we have no record of an Emma Thompson ever being enrolled here." I felt the floor drop out from under me. "What do you mean she's not enrolled?" I asked Emma later, as she pushed her cereal around in her bowl, making soupy circles. She looked up at me, her expression unreadable. "Daddy said school is a waste of time," she said quietly. "That Crystal will teach us at home." A chill went down my spine. "But," Emma added, her voice dropping to a whisper, "Crystal doesn't like it when we ask questions." My blood froze. Crystal was supposed to be homeschooling them? The woman who looked at them like they were vermin? The woman who forced my brother to get them out of the house? It made no sense. It was more than just irresponsible parenting. It felt sinister. It felt like they were being deliberately isolated. The more I watched them, the more I saw the shadows of whatever life they'd been living. They hoarded food, stuffing crackers or pieces of fruit into their pockets, as if they weren't sure when their next meal would be. They were jumpy, constantly looking over their shoulders as if expecting to be scolded or punished for some unknown crime. The 2 weeks my brother had promised turned into 3, then 4. My small apartment began to feel like a lifeboat, and I was desperately trying to patch up 2 little souls who had been set adrift in a storm. My life had been completely upended. My career, my social life, my sanity, it was all hanging by a thread. But as I tucked them into bed each night, into the makeshift bedroom I had created for them in my living room, and saw the fear slowly start to recede from their eyes, I knew I couldn't give up. This wasn't about me anymore. This wasn't about a favor from my manipulative brother. A part of me already knew, with a certainty that terrified me, that he wasn't coming back. These weren't temporary guests. They were refugees, and I was the only safe harbor they had. A month had passed since that 2 a.m. phone call. A month of my life being completely consumed by a whirlwind of diapers, nightmares, and lukewarm chicken nuggets. My apartment, once my quiet sanctuary, was now a chaotic landscape of toys and tiny socks. My own life felt like a distant memory. The silence from Marcus was absolute, a gaping void that screamed louder than any angry voicemail ever could. The hope that he would call, that this was all a terrible misunderstanding, was shriveling up and dying inside me. I was alone in this, and the weight of it was starting to crush me. One afternoon, there was a soft knock on my door. It was Mrs. Henderson from apartment 3B. A sweet, grandmotherly woman in her 70s with kind eyes and a plate of still warm chocolate chip cookies in her hands. "Dear, excuse me for intruding," she said, her gaze drifting past me to where Emma and Jake were sitting on the floor, mesmerized by cartoons. "But are these your brother's children?" I nodded, forcing a smile. "Yes, they're staying with me for a little while." She looked from them back to me, her brow furrowed with a gentle concern. "I saw them a few times before, you know, when he used to bring them by. But they seem different." "Different? How?" I asked, my heart starting to beat a little faster. She lowered her voice, leaning in slightly. "Thinner," she said quietly. "And scared. The little girl said hello to me in the hallway yesterday, but when I smiled back at her, she practically jumped behind your legs, as if she thought she was going to be scolded for it." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut, because it was true. They lived in a state of constant apprehension, as if waiting for an invisible hammer to fall. Mrs. Henderson's observation, coming from an outsider, validated the gnawing fear that had been growing in me for weeks. I wasn't just being an overly worried aunt. Something was deeply, horribly wrong. Taking a deep breath, I decided to take a chance. "Mrs. Henderson, can I ask you a really strange question?" She nodded, her eyes full of sympathy. "Did you happen to see my brother leaving here? About a month ago? It would have been in the early morning." She frowned, her eyes clouding over with thought. "Now that you mention it," she said slowly, "yes, I did. He left with a blonde woman. They were carrying suitcases." My stomach twisted into a tight knot. "It was very late," she continued, "maybe around 3 in the morning. I remember thinking it was odd, because the children weren't with them. And there it was, the final, devastating piece of the puzzle. My world didn't just tilt, it completely capsized. Marcus hadn't just dropped the kids off and left for work the next morning, as I had assumed. No, his actions were far more cruel, more calculated. He had dumped his children on my doorstep, waited until he was sure I was settled, and then he and Crystal had fled like thieves in the dead of night. He had left them sleeping on my couch without so much as a goodbye. The cookies on the plate blurred as my eyes filled with tears. I thanked Mrs. Henderson, my voice choked, and closed the door. That night, after I finally got Emma and Jake to sleep, I locked myself in the bathroom, slid down to the cold tile floor, and I cried. But these weren't just tears of sadness or exhaustion. They were tears of pure, unadulterated rage. Rage at my brother, for his cowardice, for his cruelty. How could any parent do that? How could he use his own children as disposable baggage, dropping them off so he could run away to a new life with his girlfriend? Rage at myself for being so naive, for wanting to believe the best of him when he had shown me time and time again who he really was. I had fallen for his oldest trick, playing the victim, preying on my sense of family duty. But underneath the anger, a new feeling was taking root: terror. As I looked at my reflection in the dark bathroom mirror, I saw the face of a woman who was in way over her head. But looking past my own reflection, I saw the faces of Emma and Jake in my mind, traumatized, neglected, and utterly alone in the world except for me. I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that there was no going back now. This wasn't a temporary arrangement anymore. It was my life. They were my responsibility. Whether I wanted it or not, whether I was ready or not, it didn't matter. The next morning, the rage had cooled into a steely resolve. The time for waiting and hoping was over. I couldn't protect them by just giving them warm meals and a safe place to sleep. I needed answers. I needed to understand the true extent of the damage. I picked up my phone, not to try Marcus's dead number, but to call the nearest pediatric clinic. I made emergency appointments for both Emma and Jake. I was done being a passive victim in my brother's sick game. It was time to start fighting back. The pediatric clinic was cold and sterile, smelling of antiseptic wipes and anxiety. I held Emma and Jake's hands tightly, feeling their nervous energy radiate into me. The waiting room was filled with the cheerful sounds of other children, but my niece and nephew were silent, huddled close to my side. I had filled out the paperwork with shaking hands, leaving the last doctor's visit section painfully blank because I had no idea. Dr. Martinez was a kind-looking man in his 50s, with a gentle demeanor that immediately put the children at ease. He examined them with a meticulous and gentle touch, but I could see the professional concern hardening in his eyes as he went on. He measured their height and weight, listened to their hearts, and then he asked to speak with me alone in his office. "Miss Sarah, I'm going to be direct with you," he said, his gaze steady and serious. "These children are severely malnourished. Emma, at her age, should weigh at least 15 kilos. She's barely 12. Jake should be speaking in full sentences by now, but his vocabulary is that of a 2-year-old. My heart hammered against my ribs. "You mean they're sick?" "Not sick in the traditional sense," he clarified, "but they are profoundly neglected. Neglect is a form of abuse, and the signs are all here." He paused, his expression growing graver. "And the bruises on Emma. She told me she fell down the stairs 3 times this month. It's possible, of course, but it's statistically very unlikely." He looked at me, his eyes full of a heavy knowledge. "I am required by law to report suspected cases of abuse or neglect to social services. Can you tell me about the family situation?" I told him everything. The 2 a.m. call, the manipulative plea, the rigid folder of rules, the disappearance of my brother, the disconnected phones, Crystal. The whole sordid, unbelievable story spilled out of me. He listened patiently, taking notes without a word. That night, the weight of the doctor's words settled over my apartment like a thick fog. I was giving Jake a bath, the warm water and quiet of the evening creating a rare moment of peace. He was playing with a little rubber duck, and then, out of nowhere, he looked up at me with his big, soulful eyes and spoke the first complete sentence I had ever heard him say. "Sarah, are you going away too?" The question shattered my heart into a million pieces. I knelt beside the tub, my voice thick with emotion. "No, sweetheart, I'm not going anywhere. I promise." He seemed to consider this, pushing the duck under the water. "Daddy said he was coming back," he said softly. "Mommy said that too. They always say they're coming back." "Mommy?" I asked, my breath catching. "Jake, do you remember your mommy?" He nodded. "Mommy Jenny. She had hair like Emma's." He looked away, his voice barely a whisper. "Daddy said she went away because she didn't like us." Jennifer, Marcus's ex-wife. The story I'd always been told was that she had just walked out, that she couldn't handle being a mother and abandoned them. Now, hearing it from this tiny, broken child, the story felt thin and wrong. Just then, Emma appeared in the bathroom doorway, clutching her worn teddy bear. "Sarah, can I tell you a secret?" she asked. She came closer and whispered in my ear, her breath warm and smelling of toothpaste. "Daddy said not to tell about the women who visited our house at night. He said it's an adult secret." My blood ran cold. "Different women?" she continued. "They made noise in Daddy's room. Crystal got angry and screamed at them. She screamed at me and Jake too. Said we were too noisy and nobody wanted us. Later that night, long after the children were asleep, I sat in the glow of my laptop screen, my mind racing. Mommy Jenny, Adult Secrets, a story that was falling apart at the seams. On a desperate whim, I started searching for Jennifer, Marcus's ex-wife. It took hours of scrolling through profiles, but I finally found her, Jennifer Williams, formerly Collins. She was remarried, living a few hours away. The photos on her profile showed a smiling, happy woman, but as I looked closer, I saw a familiar sadness in her eyes. It was the same haunted look I saw in Emma's. My heart pounding, I took a deep breath and typed out a message. "Hi, Jennifer. I'm Sarah, Marcus's sister. I need to talk to you about Emma and Jake. It's urgent." I stared at the screen, expecting to wait days, if I got a reply at all. But 20 minutes later, a notification popped up. It was from her. My hands trembled as I opened the message. The words on the screen knocked the air from my lungs. "My God, Sarah. I've been looking for them for 2 years. Where are they?" And just like that, the entire, horrifying truth crashed down on me. Jennifer hadn't abandoned her children. My brother, my own flesh and blood, had stolen them. He had fled in the middle of the night 2 years ago, moving from place to place to make sure their own mother could never find them. This wasn't just neglect. This wasn't just abandonment. This was something so much darker, so much more sinister, and I was standing right in the middle of it. We agreed to meet at a neutral, public place, a small coffee shop downtown. 2 days later, I was sitting at a corner table, my hands wrapped around a lukewarm cup of coffee I had no intention of drinking. I felt sick with nerves. I was about to meet the woman my family had painted as a villain, the ghost who haunted my brother's past. When Jennifer walked in, my first thought was that she looked exactly like her photos, tired but resilient. She clutched a thick, legal-looking folder to her chest like a shield, and her eyes, red-rimmed from crying, scanned the room until they landed on me. The first few moments were awkward and choked with unspoken emotion. Then, I took out my phone and showed her the pictures I'd taken over the past month. A small video of Jake laughing as he chased Bubbles in the park. A photo of Emma, sleeping peacefully, her face finally free from fear. The moment she saw them, the dam broke. "My baby," she whispered, her finger tracing Emma's face on the screen. "Oh God, she's so thin. What did he do to them?" Over the next hour, Jennifer laid out the contents of her folder and her heart, telling me a story that made the neglect I had witnessed seem like a fairy tale. Marcus had been a monster long before Crystal. He was a master manipulator, a puppeteer of emotions. He was controlling from the very beginning, she said, her voice shaking with a memory of it. "He cut me off from my family, my friends. He controlled every penny I spent. Whenever I talked about leaving, whenever I tried to do something for myself, he would use Emma against me," she continued, wiping her eyes with a napkin. "He'd tell me I was a horrible mother, that no judge in the world would ever give me custody of my own daughter. When Jake was born, things got even worse. Marcus started bringing other women home, right into their family house, claiming Jennifer didn't satisfy him anymore." My mind reeled, connecting this to Emma's secret about the women who visited at night. I asked the question that had been burning in my mind. "Why didn't you just take them and run?" "I tried," she whispered, her gaze dropping to the table. "One night, I packed our bags. I had Emma in her car seat, but he found me in the garage before I could even pull out. He dragged me back into the house, and he locked me in our bedroom for 3 days. He told me if I ever tried to leave with the kids again, he'd make them disappear where I'd never, ever find them. And that's exactly what he did. He eventually kicked her out of the house, keeping the children, and began his life on the run. always one step ahead of the private investigator she hired with what little money she had left. The last time I saw my children, Emma was 3 and Jake was only 1, she said, her voice cracking. They probably don't even remember me. Emma remembers, I said softly. She told me about Mommy Jenny just the other day. A fresh wave of tears streamed down Jennifer's face, but this time, they were tears of relief. That afternoon, Jennifer came back to my apartment. Watching her get reacquainted with her children was one of the most beautiful and painful things I've ever witnessed. Emma was shy at first, but then a flicker of recognition crossed her face, and soon she was showing Jennifer her favorite doll. Jake, however, hid behind my legs, a stranger to his own mother. In the middle of this fragile reunion, Mrs. Henderson knocked on my door. Her expression was grim. "Sarah, dear, I need to show you something," she said with a new urgency in her voice. She led me to her apartment next door and pulled out an old shoebox. "I know it might seem like I'm a meddling old busybody," she said, "but I was worried about those children for months. Whenever I saw them, they looked so haunted." She opened the box, and inside were dozens of photographs. The images were a gut punch. There were photos of Emma and Jake playing alone in a yard for hours, wearing clothes that were dirty and too small. Photos of trash bags piling up by the door of the house they used to live in. Photos of different cars, different men, coming and going at all hours of the night. The worst one showed Emma, who couldn't have been more than 4.5, sitting on a curb in the middle of the street, trying to console a sobbing Jake while what looked like a party raged on inside the house. "Why didn't you call the police?" I whispered, horrified. "I did. Once," she said with a heavy sigh. "A social worker came. But Marcus, he can be so charming. The house was spotless. The kids were quiet. He told her I was just a crazy old neighbor making things up. After that, he moved." She pushed the box into my hands. "Take this. If you're going to fight for them, you're going to need all the proof you can get." That night, after Jennifer left with a promise to call her lawyer first thing in the morning, I sat on Emma's makeshift bed. "Emma," I began gently, "do you remember ever having to stay home alone with Jake?" She nodded, hugging her bear tighter. "Sometimes. Daddy went out with Crystal, or the other women." Her voice was a tiny whisper. "He said I was a big girl and could take care of Jake. But I was scared. Jake cried a lot, and I didn't know how to make him stop." "How old were you when this started?" "I was 4, she said. "Daddy said if I told anyone, they would take us to a place where bad children go. A 4-year-old, forced to be a mother to a baby, threatened into silence. I had thought my brother was irresponsible, selfish, and weak. I was wrong. He was a monster. That night, a decision solidified in my soul. I didn't care what it took. I didn't care if I had to fight the system, bend the rules, or break the law. Those children would never, ever go back to him. Some things are more important than rules." The box of photos from Mrs. Henderson and Jennifer's heartbreaking story shifted something fundamental inside me. We were no longer just 2 women wronged by the same man. We were soldiers in a war to save 2 innocent children. We needed more than just stories and old pictures. We needed to find him. We needed hard, undeniable evidence of what he was doing now. That's when Jennifer and I pooled our money and hired a private investigator. Detective Williams was a serious, no-nonsense man in his 40s, a former cop who now specialized in the tangled, ugly world of family law and custody battles. When we sat in his small, cluttered office and laid out the whole story, the late-night drop-off, the neglect, Jennifer's abduction story, the shoebox full of photos, he just nodded gravely. "I've seen this before," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Men who use their kids as pawns. They don't want the responsibility, but they refuse to give up custody. It's all about control. He took the case, but not before giving us a stark warning. I need you to be prepared. When we find him, this could get ugly. Men like your brother don't like losing control. He was right, but I never could have imagined how ugly it would truly be. Less than a week later, Detective Williams called. "Sarah, are you sitting down?" he asked, and the tone of his voice immediately set my nerves on edge. "I found your brother." "Where is he?" I asked, my heart pounding. Was he in some dingy apartment, broke and desperate? Had he come to his senses? "He's in Las Vegas," the detective said. "He and the girlfriend Crystal are staying at the Bellagio." The Bellagio, one of the most famous luxury hotels on the Vegas Strip. I was speechless. "And Sarah," he continued, "he's not just getting by, he's living like a king." He emailed me a file while we were on the phone. I clicked it open, and my stomach churned. It was screenshots from Marcus and Crystal's social media accounts, which were set to private but easy enough for a professional to access. There they were, grinning into the camera. Pictures of them clinking champagne glasses by a sparkling pool, posing in front of expensive restaurants, fanning out handfuls of cash at a poker table. A life of pure, unapologetic luxury, all while his children were recovering from malnutrition in my tiny apartment. "How?" I whispered into the phone. "How is he paying for any of this?" "That," Detective Williams said, "is the interesting part. He's paying for it with your tax dollars. And mine." He then explained the scheme. A grift so audacious and cruel it was hard to comprehend. Marcus was collecting government benefits as a struggling single father. Not just in one state, but in 3. He had used fake identities, likely with Crystal's help, to apply for food assistance, subsidized housing, and cash pensions for children in need. All of it was based on the lie that he was a devoted single dad raising Emma and Jake all by himself. My brother was literally funding his 5-star vacation by profiting from the children he had abandoned. But the depravity didn't stop there. "There's more," Williams said grimly. "He's done this before. 2 years ago, he had another child, a little boy, with an ex-girlfriend named Rebecca. The story was sickeningly familiar. Marcus disappeared when the baby was born, but not before taking all the money and gifts from the baby shower. I called Rebecca later that day, and she tearfully confirmed every word. The discoveries kept coming, each one darker than the last. Detective Williams' financial trace showed Marcus had moved over $50,000 in the last 6 months alone. Fraudulent benefits, money borrowed from women he was dating, and even a $20,000 loan he'd secured by using Emma as a dependent. "He's literally selling his own children," I whispered, horrified. "Essentially, yes," Williams confirmed. "And Crystal isn't just some girlfriend along for the ride. She's an accomplice." He sent me another file. This time, it was screenshots of text messages between Marcus and Crystal that he had managed to obtain. They were discussing their plan. A plan to make me assume total responsibility for the kids, permanently, while they continued to collect the benefits. They were actively plotting how to get rid of Emma and Jake for good. Then came the final, terrifying blow. "Sarah, they know you have the children," Williams said, his voice urgent. "Marcus hired someone to follow you. He knows where you live. And he's coming back to town, not to take the kids back, but to force you to sign legal custody over to you, while he keeps all the parental rights, and, more importantly, the benefits." The blood drained from my face. He wasn't just a deadbeat dad or a con artist. He was a predator, and he was coming for me. That night, the fear was a living thing in my apartment, but it was overshadowed by a cold, hard rage. I went online and ordered security cameras. I called a 24-hour locksmith and had all the locks on my doors and windows changed. I was done being the victim. I was done being his naive little sister. The battle was no longer in Las Vegas or in the past. It was coming to my front door, and this time I would be ready for it. 3 days. For 3 days, I lived on a knife's edge, jumping at every sound, my phone clutched in my hand. The security cameras I'd installed fed a live stream to my phone, and I watched the view of my front door obsessively. I had already briefed Mrs. Henderson, and Jennifer was on standby, ready to come at a moment's notice. I had a plan. I just prayed I wouldn't have to use it. He showed up on the 3rd day, just as the sun was beginning to set. A flashy rental car pulled up to the curb. Marcus got out, but he wasn't alone. He had 2 large, intimidating-looking men with him, the kind of guys you hire when you want to send a message without saying a word. And in the passenger seat, I could see the silhouette of his girlfriend, Crystal. She didn't even bother to get out of the car. I had already herded Emma and Jake into the back bedroom, putting headphones on them with their favorite cartoon cranked up to full volume. My heart was hammering against my ribs, but my hands were steady. I was ready. "Sarah, open this door! Where are my children?" Marcus bellowed, his voice echoing in the hallway. He sounded like the aggrieved father, the victim. "They're not your children to demand anymore, Marcus." I yelled back through the locked door. "You abandoned them a month ago to go live it up at the Bellagio. You can't just show up here and act like a father." There was a tense silence. Then, a shrill, furious voice cut through the air from the car. "Look here, you meddling brat!" It was Crystal, screaming from the passenger window. "Those children are messing up our life. Marcus and I have plans, and those kids are not part of them." "Crystal, shut up!" Marcus hissed, but the damage was done. She had just confirmed everything. One of the hired goons stepped forward, his voice a low threat. "Look, lady, he's the legal father. He can put these kids wherever he wants. You should be grateful he's letting you keep them instead of shipping them off to an orphanage." And that's when I heard it. A sound that ripped through my resolve and straight into my soul. Emma was screaming. She must have pulled off her headphones. She had heard their voices. "Please don't take me back," she cried, her voice muffled by the door but filled with pure terror. "Sarah, don't let them take me." Something inside me snapped. All the fear, all the planning, it all melted away into a wave of protective fury. I threw the deadbolt and ripped the door open, standing face to face with my brother for the first time in months. He looked terrible. Thinner, with bloodshot eyes and a frantic, nervous energy that screamed of something more than just stress. "Did you hear that?" I screamed, my voice shaking with rage. "That is the sound of your own daughter begging not to go with you. What kind of father are you?" He tried to play it cool, a sinister smirk spreading across his face. "You turned her against me," he accused. "But that's okay. We can fix this. It's simple. You're going to file for legal custody. You take all the responsibility, all the expenses, but I keep my parental rights, and I can visit whenever I want." "And why on earth would I do that?" I spat. "Because the alternative," he said, his voice dropping to a cold, cruel whisper, "is I take them right now and put them in an orphanage today. Your choice, Sarah." Just then, Crystal stormed out of the car, her patience gone. "Marcus, stop beating around the bush," she shrieked. "Either she agrees to take these brats forever, or we take them now and you'll never see them again." It was at that exact moment, with the threat hanging in the air and my terrified children hiding behind my legs, that 2 police cars screeched to a halt at the curb. Officer Martinez, followed by 3 other officers, was out of his car in a flash. Mrs. Henderson had made the call the second she saw Marcus arrive. Marcus immediately morphed back into the concerned father. "Officer, thank God you're here," he began. "My sister is illegally keeping my children from me." But before he could continue his performance, a small voice cut through the tension. It was Emma. She ran from behind me, straight to Officer Martinez. "That's not true," she shouted, pointing a tiny, trembling finger at her father. "Daddy wants Sarah to take care of us forever, but he still wants to get money for us." The entire situation imploded. Crystal, realizing Marcus was about to throw her under the bus, completely lost it. "You knew, Marcus," she screamed. "You said you didn't care what happened as long as Sarah stopped interfering and took total responsibility for these brats." The silence that followed was deafening. It was a full confession. And just to seal their fate, Mrs. Henderson emerged from her apartment, holding up her phone. "I got it all on video, officer," she said calmly. It was over. As Officer Martinez slapped the handcuffs on my brother, Marcus stared at me, his eyes burning with pure hatred. "This isn't over, Sarah," he snarled. "I'm still their legal father. You're going to regret this." Crystal was also arrested, screaming that it was all my fault, that Marcus was the real victim. As the police cars pulled away, taking the monsters out of our lives, I sank to the floor of my living room and pulled my 2 trembling children into my arms. The immediate threat was gone, but Marcus's final words echoed in my ears. He was right about one thing. He was still their legal father. The battle was over, but the war for their future was just beginning. The 2 months that followed Marcus's arrest were a blur of legal meetings, paperwork, and sleepless nights. It was an intense, exhausting battle. Jennifer hired the best custody lawyer she could afford, and I found a compassionate but tough-as-nails attorney named Mrs. Patterson, who specialized in adoption and child welfare cases. "The case is complex, Mrs." Patterson explained during our first meeting, her office lined with photos of smiling families she had helped create. "Marcus still has parental rights, even from a jail cell. Our job is to prove to the court that he is permanently inadequate as a father, not just temporarily. We have to show that terminating his rights is in the absolute best interest of the children." For Jake, the path was even more complicated, as we needed to prove that placing him with Jennifer and me was the best path forward, despite her not being his biological mother. Fortunately, our arsenal of evidence was overwhelming. Detective Williams had dug even deeper, discovering Marcus was over $100,000 in gambling debt. He had a clear, established pattern of abandoning children when they became inconvenient. And the financial fraud was staggering. He had collected over $80,000 in fraudulent benefits across 3 different states. Dr. Martinez provided the court with his complete psychological evaluations of Emma and Jake. The reports were heartbreaking, detailing Emma's clear signs of post-traumatic stress disorder and Jake's significant speech delays due to trauma and neglect. But he also documented their incredible progress. "Both children have shown dramatic improvement in the last 8 weeks," he wrote. "They have gained weight, their anxieties are lessening, and they are beginning to demonstrate age-appropriate behaviors. The cause of this change is clear: a stable, safe, and nurturing environment. I had," he wrote, "literally saved them." The preliminary hearing was held on a Thursday morning. Marcus was led into the courtroom in handcuffs and an orange prison uniform. He had lost even more weight and looked hollowed out, the arrogant swagger completely gone, replaced by the shaky demeanor of a man going through withdrawal. Jennifer sat beside me, her hand gripping mine so tightly our knuckles were white. She had spent every possible moment reconnecting with Emma, and the fragile bond between mother and daughter was slowly, beautifully rebuilding. When Emma was called to testify, I held my breath. The judge, a kind but stern man named Judge Harrison, came down from his bench and crouched to her level. "Emma, do you know why we're all here today?" he asked gently. She nodded, her small face serious. "To decide where me and Jake are going to live forever." "And where would you like to live, sweetie?" "With Sarah and Mommy Jenny," she said immediately, without a shred of hesitation. "They love us. They give us food when we're hungry, and they don't scream at us." "Do you want to live with your daddy?" the judge asked. Emma's eyes flickered toward Marcus. He tried to force a smile, but she physically recoiled, shrinking behind the judge's chair. "Daddy did bad things," she said in a small voice. "He left us alone a lot, and Crystal screamed that we were too noisy. I don't want to go back there." She told the judge about the times there was no food in the house, about how her daddy said she was big enough to take care of Jake by herself, even though she didn't know how. When it was Jake's turn, he simply hid his face in my side, refusing to speak to anyone, only whispering, "I want to stay with Sarah." Finally, Marcus had his chance to speak. He stood up and tried to sell a story of a flawed father who had made mistakes but loved his children and was ready to change. Judge Harrison listened impassively until he was finished. Then he leaned forward, his voice cold as steel. "Mr. Thompson, you abandoned these children. You collected fraudulent benefits in their name while they were living with someone else. You then attempted to blackmail your own sister into taking them permanently while you maintained control. How do you explain that?" Marcus stammered, trying to deflect, blaming Crystal, blaming his circumstances. I thought it would be better for them to have legal stability," he mumbled, "but I still wanted to be a part of their lives." "While continuing to collect money based on the lie that you were caring for them?" the judge shot back. Marcus's silence was his confession. Judge Harrison looked from Marcus to the children, and then to Jennifer and me. His face softened for a moment before he turned his gaze back to my brother. "Mr. Thompson," he said, his voice echoing in the silent courtroom. "In my 20 years on this bench, I have rarely seen such a clear, calculated case of child abandonment and exploitation. You did not just neglect your parental duties, you actively and criminally profited from that negligence." He raised his hand, silencing Marcus's attempt to protest. Based on the overwhelming evidence presented, the children's own testimony, the medical documentation of neglect, the proof of widespread benefit fraud, and your established pattern of abandonment, this court hereby permanently terminates Marcus Thompson's parental rights over Emma Thompson and Jake Thompson. The gavel struck the wood with a final, deafening crack. It was the sound of freedom. It was the sound of chains breaking. A massive, crushing weight lifted off my shoulders, and I broke down, sobbing with relief. Jennifer wrapped her arms around me, and we cried together as we watched Marcus being led away, his face a mask of disbelief and defeated rage. Emma and Jake were safe. Finally, irrevocably, safe. They were ours. 2 years later, you wouldn't even recognize our lives. The chaos of the courtroom and the terror of those first few months have faded, replaced by a beautiful, ordinary, and hard-won peace. Jennifer got full custody of Emma, and I officially, legally, became Jake's mother. But we knew we could never separate them. So we did something a little crazy. We bought houses on the same block, our backyards connected by a small gate that is almost always open. We are a team. A strange and wonderful patchwork family built from the wreckage of my brother's destruction. Emma is flourishing. She's at the top of her reading group, has a gaggle of friends, and has regained all the weight she lost. The haunted, fearful look in her eyes is gone, replaced by the genuine, carefree laughter of a happy child. And Jake, my sweet boy, has made the most incredible progress. With speech therapy and endless love, he's become a little chatterbox, telling silly jokes that make his big sister howl with laughter. The nightmares have stopped. He doesn't flinch anymore. He is whole. The other morning, as I was making pancakes, Emma, who had stayed for a sleepover, looked at me with an unnerving seriousness that only children can possess. "Sarah," she asked, "do you ever regret helping us? I know your life got really different because of us." I knelt down and took her small face in my hands. "Emma, sweetheart," I told her, my voice thick with emotion, "you and Jake didn't change my life. You made it complete. I don't regret a single second, and I have never meant anything more." Marcus is still in prison, serving a 5-year sentence for fraud and child abandonment. Crystal was deported after it was discovered she was in the country illegally and had been an active accomplice in his crimes. Neither of them has ever tried to contact us. They are just ghosts, echoes from a life that feels like it belonged to someone else. My brother thought he was so clever, using me as a free babysitter so he could escape his responsibilities. He thought he was showing me the price of my sentimentality. But in the end, the price he paid was losing his children forever. The price I paid was gaining a love so fierce and unconditional it fills every corner of my world. And that's the part I really want to talk about with you all. It's what I lie awake thinking about sometimes. My brother was right about one thing he said on that first phone call. Family doesn't abandon family. He just didn't understand what family truly island. It's not blood. It's not obligation. It's about love, sacrifice, and showing up when it matters most. He thought he was giving me a burden, but he actually gave me the 2 greatest gifts of my life. So I have to ask you guys, what would you have done? Would you have hung up the phone that night? At what point does the sacred duty of family end and self-preservation begin? So many of us are taught that blood is thicker than water. But what happens when that blood is toxic? Is it ever okay to cut ties with a family member, especially when children are involved? My brother destroyed our family, but in doing so, he allowed me and Jennifer to build a new one, a better one. I gained everything, and he lost it all. So who really ended up paying the higher price? He showed me that strength isn't about what you can endure, but about who you choose to protect. If this story made you feel understood, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to Coco Table Reddit. Every follow and comment gives me the motivation to keep sharing these real, emotional stories with you. And if you have a story of your own, feel free to share it in the comments. I'm always here to listen.